Today is Friday, August 23rd in 2024, and we welcome you to our Chapter 49 podcast. Chapter 49 represents most IRS employees in the state of Indiana. My name is Larry Lannan. I'm a retiree, and I do some volunteer work for Chapter 49 in the area of communications. This podcast being a part of that, we welcome you as always, and very happy you've chosen to spend a little bit of your time watching or listening to our podcast. It's on YouTube every time we do a podcast, and we also have the audio podcast on a number of audio platforms where you can find it. So you can always subscribe, comment, whatever you wish to do on the podcast on whatever platform you wish to choose to consume our podcast. We will not have a podcast next week, but this week we do have Duncan Giles, our Chapter 49 president. Welcome again, Duncan.
Thanks, Larry. It's always good to be here.
Well, I want to just point out something. We have now, as of the day we record this, both of the major party political conventions are over. And I just want to put on my guy who studied political science hat on for a moment, because what I'm about to say is not partisan in any way. We're going to talk about the Hatch Act in every podcast we post up from between now and the election day. But we have some reminders later for the Hatch Act, so we want you to be careful not to violate that. But what I would suggest people do, Duncan, is watch the political polling. I mean, the media has to have something to talk about, so they commission polls. And what political scientists have found is that when you're talking about a horse race, in a presidential campaign, before the conventions are done, people will just say anything because they really haven't. Most people have not thought about it. For those of us who are political junkies, most people in America are not political junkies, and they're not tuned into it or paying much attention until after the political conventions are over. All the studies have shown most voters make up their minds right after the political conventions. So the polling we're going to see in the next couple of weeks, late August into early September, will tell us the starting point of the campaign. Who's ahead, who's not, is it close? Is it within the margin of error, which you always have to watch at a political poll because they're just geeky kind of exercises in deep mathematics, really, and all. So what you're doing there is just trying to quantify that margin of error and try to figure out what voters are thinking, but understanding that you're not going to be precisely right every time. So watch these polls you see in the next couple of weeks that are being taken of voters after this last convention is over. We'll know where the campaign starts, and we'll go from there. Your thoughts?
Yeah, polling is, I think, was much more reliable perhaps 40 years ago, before you had the invention. A lot of people now don't have home phones where they can't call home phones, things of that nature. I think to me, it's almost like the polls are important, but the trends are even more important, not particular numbers, but do you see an upswing for one candidate or another? That's more of a tell for me on what exactly is happening. But you're exactly right. People aren't, you and I are both very much political junkies. We talk about it, we enjoy it, dissect it, discuss it, whatever you want to call it, we do it. But like I say, most aren't. And after the conventions where everybody's spoken their minds and laid everything out, now's when people start paying attention and are going to decide how they're going to vote or if they're going to vote.
Okay, and we are going to talk more about the Hatch Act later on in the podcast. But to start off, let's talk about a subject really is a good subject, at least for now. We hope nothing changes. That's the Inflation Reduction Act. I hesitate to use IRA because people think that's an individual retirement account. But Inflation Reduction Act that was passed during the early part of the Biden administration by the Congress gave money to the IRS to deal with a lot of things that have been neglected, staffing and IT, information technology in particular, to get the IRS back up to where it should be in terms of doing compliance and just having the technology needed to do the work of tax administration. So far, the numbers are like this. The IRS has spent $6 billion, that's with a B, and they have about 57 billion remaining. So Duncan, from what you have seen and what the National NTEU has learned from discussions with the management at IRS, do we know how the agency plans to spend down that $57 billion left in that account?
They're still making plans on exactly what they want to do. What originally when this came out, it was sort of like, okay, they'll get so many billion per year, which is the way it was explained. But basically, what it is now is this money is like in, for lack of a better term, a savings account. So they can draw on it when they need it. So they still have this 57 billion they can use up until 2030, I believe it is. And IRS is making strides in hiring. They still want to hire more, particularly enforcement folks, but also folks in the clerical field. They still want to beef up customer service, whether it's at in the tax, in on the phones. They want to beef up taxpayer advocate so that people who fall through the cracks can get more assistance. And also, we, as everybody who's listening to this that works for the IRS knows, oh my God, do we need to improve our technology? They're making incremental progress. I will say that they're making incremental progress, but we absolutely still need to do more. And I know they're planning to do more. We want to make it more transparent for the taxpayers so they have access to their information, while also keeping the safeguards in place to make sure that nobody can mess with their accounts or do anything untoward, but get them the information. Get more up-to-date information on for the folks who are calling in, so that telephone assisters, folks in a TAC, can pull that information up more readily. Folks in the field who work in the field, well, if they're saying, well, I made a payment on this 2 days ago. Okay, well, let me go in and be able to see that, because right now they really can't unless the taxpayer gives them a copy of a check or something of that nature. So it's something that's still a work in progress, but we absolutely still need these funds to get the IRS back up to where it needs to be, because as you and I have talked about before, the other factor in there is retirement, because more and more of our folks are getting seasoned and able to retire, and when they're able to, a lot of them are going. And so we need to replace that knowledge out the door and make sure that we have good folks coming in.
Yeah, and I think the two things that we've talked about in previous podcasts, and I do think is relevant to what you just said. We can't just spend the money tomorrow and everything's in place. We can't say, okay, here's 57 billion. We have 30,000 employees, and by God, our technology is now up to date and state of the art. Even with the money to do it, it takes time to do that. And as we've mentioned, you have to take your best people offline to do the instructing of new employees, to do the coaching for new employees as they begin the job, to give all these people the support they need to get the job done. Because if you don't do that right, people leave and you've got all that investment squandered and you have to start over again with a new employee. So technology is the same thing. It takes time, as you mentioned, to bring technology online. We have to attract and retain good people in IRA. We have contractors, obviously, and they do a good job, but we need employees to implement this, people with the right kind of security clearances and so forth, to have this information available to them about taxpayers and so forth. So I think the one thing that the public needs to know, and even people within IRS need to keep in mind, yes, we have all this money. We're very thankful for it, and we want to do the right thing with it. And I have confidence that the commissioner is doing the best he can. I think we have a good commissioner in Danny Werfel, but this doesn't happen overnight. Even when you have this money, it's going to take time. And as you said, this money will be spent totally by 2030. There's a lot that can happen between now and then, and And I guess I would like to hear your thoughts about just, the complexities of doing what needs to be done to get the IRS back up on its feet to do the work we are charged to do under the law.
Yeah. There are the hiring process, can be streamlined when they have these hiring events at several places. And I would love to see them do more across the country, spend the money there, because, I've seen and heard about things where people have gone in with a resume, talked to a few people, they streamline the process, and they have a tentative job offer within the day, which to me is just absolutely amazing. So I think those types of things are very important. The technology and, doing our systems, it's sort of like, one of the best analogies I've ever heard on that one is changing an airplane engine while it's in flight at 15,000 feet, and, trying to change the engine out for a newer one. That makes it a little difficult because you still have to fly, but you want to change it into something that does better and is more reliable, and that's what they're trying to do with a lot of our systems. We also spend money to rehire folks who used to work here to teach. Rehire to new attendants. A good friend of mine, John Kelshaw, former chapter president in New Jersey, and now NTU national area vice president. Even in his dotage, and John is advanced in his years, he still retains a lot of that information. I'm sure he has crib notes somewhere, but he's a great instructor, a good teacher, and a great person to pass that type of information along. And it also frees up resources then to be able it doesn't take somebody offline that's doing the work that actually does that type of job to have to instruct. If they want to instruct, there's absolutely available out there for people. But having people like John Kelshaw, who I'm sure is under 85 years old, but I'm not sure by how much, is able to come in, help us out, and do things like that. So that's where this money is going. And like you said, it's not a rapid progress type thing. It's slow going, but that's the best way to do it. Is also, we have to report to Congress on everything we're doing to make sure that we're doing everything we can correctly. And they want to make sure that we're not spending it frivolously, which is totally understandable.
Duncan, it's really interesting. John Kelshaw retires and he still cannot avoid barbs from you. It's like, he may still listen to this podcast. He may already know about this.
I can tell you that Mr. Kelshaw does listen to this podcast, as well as mutual friends of ours do. So I'm sure that I'll be hearing about this. But, I'm willing to take that if he can, remember that I actually did that to him.
I was going to say he may have to come back on the podcast just to respond, to a question. I didn't know he was an area vice president, so he would have standing to come back on the program and talk about NTEU. Let's move on to another subject, because we've talked about this on just about every podcast in recent months, that the president has proposed a 2% pay increase on the average next year, 2025, for federal employees. By the way, I just saw today that retirees are online to get about 2.4% in 2025, although that's not certain. We'll not know that exact figure until the end of September, and we'll know it in early October once the numbers all roll up. But we think it's going to be minimum 2.4%, and the way inflation's going on and the measures, I'm not sure it'll be much above that, if not just that itself. So the president, for people still working in federal employment, is suggesting a 2% pay raise. Congress, in its actions so far, has reaffirmed that. There have been some rumors circulating that President Biden, who has always been a good friend of the federal workforce, ever since he came into the Senate and now as president and as vice president, has always been a friend of the federal workforce. There are rumors he might, as kind of a last minute thank you, increase that 2% proposal for a pay raise. What do we know or not know about all that, Duncan?
I'm seeing a lot of rumors out there about it, but not really seeing any actual smoke, much less fire. Do I think it's a possibility? absolutely, it's a possibility. It's also a possibility I'll be named Mr. Universe this year, but that's a pretty slim possibility. And that's the same thing with, I think, the increase on the raises. The problem is, I think the president would love to give more. I would especially hope that he would do the pay parity with the military that he hasn't yet. I'm hoping we can at least pressure for that. But it has to go with the budgets for the agencies for the following year. And again, when we have these nice increases and the budgets for the agencies don't go up, I see that there are some agencies that are going to be furloughing employees for a day or 2 days before the end of the fiscal year or even next fiscal year, just to try and make the books work. So that's where you come in and say, okay, well, we'd love a higher raise, but unfortunately, it's not really possible. So for those out there who are hearing this, counting on it, if it happens, I would say fantastic. It should happen. I think we should get more. Folks in the Congress have reintroduced the bill to increase the federal pay well beyond the amount that the military is getting. Unfortunately, I don't see in this Congress that getting much traction. I would hope that the president would, reconsider the 2% and say, yes, inflation has come down, but let's even it out with the military to make sure that we've got people who are being paid, the right amount for doing the work for the American people.
Yeah, good. Well said. And it would be nice if it happened. We pushed for it. We continue as a union to push for a higher raise, but whether it will happen, it's an uphill fight. But I think we should say, even though we've been disappointed with this pay raise proposal, I think it's fair to say that Joe Biden, as a senator, as a vice president, and as a president, has very generally been a good friend of federal workers. Would you say that?
I would wholeheartedly agree. He really does. I think he has got the working person's heart in his heart, working person's needs in his heart, and understands what's going on and does what he can. And I think he feels at this point the 2% is all he can do. I'm hoping that there can be a second look at those numbers and that be raised.
Let's move on to retirement again. We mentioned it already. There's a certain senator that has proposed, first of all, that people who are working telework should get no locality pay, which we think is a rather odd proposal. But he has another one, and it has to do with retirement. Tell us what this senator is trying to cook up, but would impact people retiring from the federal government.
Yeah, the latest proposal, which this one really surprised me, is that he was thinking that, well, there's a lot of locality pay out there. And I think he's loosely tying this into telework. And this is Senator Cassidy out of Louisiana. And he's talking about, okay, well, for retirement, you're wherever you retire, you're going to get that locality pay. So if you're based in Chicago, your pay is going to be based on your high threes, which would be presumably in Chicago. If it's in Indianapolis, it would be the same for Indianapolis, which would be less than Chicago. Well, apparently he would like to see all locality pay stripped out of retirement. So basically it would be the rest of the U.S., which could impact, especially in higher price cities, Washington, D.C., the New Yorks, the L.A.s, the Chicagos. That would greatly reduce the amount of the federal pension that's out there. And I would think it would be difficult to administer in the least. And then, because once you start doing math, there gets to be mistakes, and there you go. But it would also be quite the slap to federal employees who have come on and been told, this is what your retirement is going to be. It's going to be including your locality pay. Now, do I think the entirety of Congress and the president would sign off on it? It wouldn't pass this Congress. And even if it passed, one chamber, it wouldn't pass the other, and the president would certainly not sign that. But, we've got an election coming up, and you just never know what's going to happen with the new complexion come January. So this is something when you sit there and say, well, my vote doesn't matter, this is all the same stuff. No, votes do matter. And letting your congressperson or your senator know about particular bills that are out there and whether you like them, support them or not, you're absolutely able to do that on your own time and not on government equipment. And I would encourage everybody to do that. Very easily done on ntu.org, and just make your voice heard. And there's nothing wrong with that, to defeat ideas like this that would cost a lot of people a lot of money once they retire.
And I think I want to emphasize something you said, because a lot of federal employees do know this, but for those who maybe don't pay much attention, your retirement amount that you get every month is based on your highest 3 earning years as a federal employee. So if you start stripping money out of that calculation, this will have a major impact on whatever you receive. And there aren't that many CSRS people left, but under the first calculation, it is still the high three. When you talk about high three, the 3 highest years of earning, which normally are the most recent, not always, but normally the most recent years you've had in federal employment. You take away the locality pay out of that calculation of that high three, that dramatically lowers the monthly payment you'll receive in retirement. So just to lay it out as clearly as I know, for people who don't pay attention to this, that's why we're talking about it. And that's why every federal employee not yet retired should worry about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you framed it very, very well. And when you hear the high threes, and that's one of the things that I'm always dealing with employees, it's your high 36 months. Because a lot of people say, well, it's a new year, I'm going to retire in February, but I get my high threes, that new salary in January, that's going to be counted toward my high threes. Well, if you retire in February, that's only going to be a month and a half of it. So it's literally your high 36 months. High threes is a great way to describe it, and the way the vast majority of people do. But in actuality, it's your highest 36 months consecutively that you would get to figure your retirement on.
Let's talk a little more about retirement. One thing people, I think, who have not yet applied for retirement understand, because so much of what we do is automated. I mean, we're not up to date in our technology at IRS. We've talked about that already. But even the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, and once you retire, they are your like your employer was when you're working. You work with them on your retirement. OPM is even further behind, much further behind than IRS, because when you apply for your retirement, even in the year 2024, everything is on paper. Let me repeat that. Everything is on paper. So the processing, what you submit, everything is on paper. Everything. Now, there are some studies and some tests being done to automate the system. It's going to be a long, arduous process to get that done, because it's just beginning. And this should have happened 10, 20 years ago, but it's just now beginning. I think people need to know, Duncan, I'd like you to kind of weigh in on this as well. People need to understand the process of retirement is lengthy, it's difficult, because it's all on paper. You apply on paper. OPM actually, the IRS tries to get it ready, and they did a good job for me to make sure it's in good shape before it goes to OPM, so there are no delays there. But you just need to know this whole thing is a paper endeavor, and it is a lengthy one for that reason.
Yeah, that's one of those things where, the IRS made a very heavy push to scan documents that come into us, into the service centers, as opposed to entering it by hand. You can enter it by hand, but it is still going to be much slower than scanning. And what the IRS does is we have what's called the GRB platform, where you can go in, do everything, get figured up with, what you think it's going to be. You'll get assigned a best specialist who will be assisting you with this process to make sure that, like you said, to make sure that there are no errors, mistakes, anything like that. Then once that happens, everything's done electronically. You're taking care of stuff. They print it, the best specialist print it out, print everything out on the day you retire. And again, nothing happens until the day you retire, until they get notice you've officially retired. because of the fact that up until that day you retire, you can rescind your retirement. You have that ability versus in the contract, so they can't process anything early. They can get ready and all that, but they can't do anything until then. So once that happens, they have to print it out and send it to OPM. And like you said, that's just an arduous process to do. And then OPM has to look at this and do everything manually. They are doing, like you said, doing studies and starting to do things electronically, but I don't think they'll be full electronic for several years, if not a decade. And so it's going to be, that's where the slow process comes in, because it's done by humans. So it's going to be something that's going to take a while, because OPM's like everybody else, they're not staffed up enough to where they're able to do everything they need to do. So just, I just want people to understand that it goes, even though we do it electronically, once it goes from IRS to OPM, it's on paper, and it will be continue to be on paper until it's finished processing. And that's an eye opener for a lot of people, because they did not realize it, folks that I've talked to about that.
I promised a Hatch Act discussion, and we'll have one for every podcast through Election Day. One aspect of the Hatch Act, we touched on this last time, that you should never, ever take money for a political campaign. Just don't do it. Even if you're volunteering for any political campaign, if somebody wants to make a contribution, you're on a phone bank, hand that phone to somebody who's not a federal employee. You cannot do that. But Duncan, there are other pitfalls in this process, particularly when it comes to your social media account. Tell us something that all federal employees should know when it comes to encouraging people to to contribute to a political campaign. We all have, I guess I don't have a retiree, but all of you still working for the federal government need to be very conscious of this. Explain why.
Yeah, it's grown because social media has grown into being such an everyday presence. The way that the Office of Special Counsel now looks at this, it's not just, if you're working a phone bank, like you said, that used to be the traditional thing. You're working a phone bank or something of that nature, and somebody, oh, I can't ask them for money, or they want to donate money. You can't talk to them about that. You cannot even put that on your social media. If you say, okay, I really support this candidate, whoever it might be, and I want to put something on there that they can go on my Facebook page and my friends can see this and click a link to be able to donate to a particular candidate, or something that is associated with candidates or political parties. So, you hear about these PACs that are out there, political action committees. You cannot even do that. You can't forward an email that has that information on it. Those are a couple of big things that have come up over the last several years. So even if it's electronic, be it email, be it, Facebook page, Twitter, because I still call it Twitter, not that other name, or whatever site that you're on, you don't want to have anything to do, even as something as innocuous as forwarding a email, reposting something, anything of that nature that asks people to donate money to a political person or party that's partisan. If it's nonpartisan, then yes, it's permitted, but you better make darn sure it's nonpartisan. The League of Women Voters is a good one for nonpartisan that deals with election things. You can do something of that nature because they're not associated with either party. But anything, so many of these PACs out there are associated with a particular party or a particular candidate that you just can't do it. So not even electronically would we want you to do something like that.
And if you have a question about whether an organization is or is not nonpartisan, talk to your local chapter. We can get the answer for you. And don't do anything until you know for sure it is allowed under the Hatch Act. Again, excellent reminder, Duncan, and it's time for your final comment.
Well, I'm going to piggyback first off. You can donate to a political party or political action campaign yourself. if you're not on government time or government property. So anybody can still donate themselves. They just can't solicit for others. My final thought or comment, I was reminded of something. I don't know why it sprung to mind. Our new national vice president, Terry Scott, one of his things that he is very well known for is, especially among people that he's known, is telling them that he loves them. That's what he says. I can't tell you the number of times that Terry has come up to me and said, "Duncan, I love you, man," and he means it. And that's what I think is very important. A lot of times in this world, you take things or people for granted. You don't tell them how much you care about them. So I would strongly urge, if you've got that special person in your life or people in your life, your family, your close friends, whoever it might be, I am constantly telling my wife that I love her. I tell Kim that all the time. When I'm talking to my daughter, Madison, or son-in-law, Travis, I let them know that I love them, just because I think it's important for them to do that. Because one day you're not going to be here and they won't be able to hear that. So always make sure that they know how you feel about them. I think that's very important.
Well, my final comment isn't nearly as nice as yours, because I'm going to talk about, the fact that IRS is the largest federal agency represented by NTU, but the next largest is the Border Protection people. We used to call them Customs. It's Custom and Border Protection. I want to read this story from the Associated Press just to give you an idea what our people in Border Protection have to deal with. A truckload of methamphetamine disguised as a shipment of watermelons was seized at a U.S.-Mexico border crossing in San Diego, that according to the Border Protection Agency. The methamphetamine, valued at more than $5 million, was found August 16th when the cargo aboard a tractor trailer from Mexico was unloaded for a detailed inspection. Every so many get the detailed inspection. That's what the agency told AP. Among real watermelons, the officers found 1,220 packages wrapped in paper colored like their watermelon skins, but guess what? They found something else, the meth inside that paper. The total weight of the packages amounted to, get this, 4,587 pounds. And the testing done by the agency, that's what they say, determined the contents to be meth. And guess what? That truck driver is now dealing with Homeland Security investigations, as one would suspect. Can you imagine? That's what they deal with at the border all the time. God bless our people who work at the border. They're represented by NTEU. They do such wonderful work for all of us. And Duncan, thank you for once again joining our podcast. Again, we will not be recording a podcast next week. Duncan and I just do have other things to do sometimes, and that will be the case next week. But we do intend to be back 2 weeks from now. And once again, if you like this podcast, you're here to the very end. Let other people know if you think there may be somebody out there that might enjoy the podcast or get something out of it from what Duncan and I talk about on a regular basis. Again, this is the Chapter 49 podcast. Chapter 49, we represent IRS employees in the state of Indiana, at least most of them. My name is Larry Lannan. Please be safe and be kind.